Hello, Connecting Point. Today we are coming to the pivot point in our journey through Mark's Gospel. Chapter 8 marks the middle point of the book, and we see this week something like, if we're thinking of that chiastic structure where the main message comes in the middle of the thing, we actually are seeing something like that in this story this week. We're also going to be seeing Jesus' ministry change shape a little bit as we move towards Jerusalem through the rest of the story, where we're going to have the climax of the story, the Passion Week, that'll start in a couple weeks' time in our study. In this set of stories this week, we're going to see that Peter confesses who the Lord is, but that there is also a lot of really profound misunderstanding about who Jesus is. And Mark seems to be hoping that we're going to see Christ more clearly than the people who he's interacting with were seeing him when he was doing his ministry on earth, and that's going to end up becoming the focal point of our table talks today. So let's start by reading through the first half of the text. We're going to read Mark chapter 8 starting at verse 1, and we'll go all the way through verse 26. In those days there was another large crowd with nothing to eat, so Jesus called his disciples and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have already been here with me 3 days, and they have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from a great distance. His disciples answered him, Where can someone get enough bread in this desolate place to satisfy these people? And he asked them, How many loaves do you have? They replied, 7. And then he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. After he took the 7 loaves and gave thanks, he broke them, and began giving them to the disciples to serve. So they served the crowd. They also had a few small fish. After giving thanks for these, he told them to serve these as well. Everyone ate and was satisfied, and they picked up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. There were about 4,000 who ate. Then he dismissed them. Immediately he got into a boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. And then the Pharisees came and began to argue with Jesus, asking for a sign from heaven to test him. Sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, Why does this generation look for a sign? I tell you the truth, no sign will be given to this generation. And then he left them, got back into the boat, and went to the other side. Now they'd forgotten to take bread, except for 1 loaf they had with them in the boat, and Jesus ordered them, Watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. And so they began to discuss with one another about having no bread. When he learned of this, Jesus said to them, Why are you arguing about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Have your hearts been hardened? Though you have eyes, don't you see? Though you have ears, can't you hear? Don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of pieces did you pick up? And they replied, 12. When I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets full of pieces did you pick up? And they replied, 7. And then he said to them, Do you still not understand? And then they came to Bethsaida. They brought a blind man to Jesus and asked him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and brought him outside of the village. And then he spit on his eyes, placed his hands on his eyes, and asked, Do you see anything? Regaining his sight, he said, I see people, but they look like trees walking. And then Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, Do not even go into the village. When I was first looking at this section of stories, I kind of called it in my mind, Jesus plays the hits. Because we see a lot of repeats of some of the things that he's already done, the things that have made him such a popular itinerant minister in Judea at this time. We see repetition of some of these miracles and teachings. We see sight being given back to a blind man. We see, again, a miraculous feeding happening. But we do see a couple of significant differences in these stories from the earlier ones. Opening with that miraculous feeding story, we see this kind of thing twice in Mark's Gospel, so we should ask ourselves, why is he including this same sort of story twice? What are the differences that are between the two? And we can look at a couple of significant differences between these two. One is the location of this event, and the other is the numbers that are referenced in the stories. So the "in those days" at the beginning of the story refers to Jesus and the disciples' continued presence in the Decapolis, which is, as we explored last week, a more Gentile territory than a Jewish territory. people are still flocking to Jesus, and so it's clear that on some level, his ministry is reaching out across the cultural barriers, right? And Doug explored that idea last week of how Jesus breaks down the barriers. The numbers also are suggestive that Jesus is ministering to the Gentiles here. 12, the number of baskets that's left over in the first story, represents the tribes of Israel typically. And 7, the number of baskets that we see left over this time, is often representative of wholeness or completeness for the Hebrew people. So it could be referring to this idea that Jesus is expanding his ministry out unto the whole world. Jesus refers deliberately to these numbers in a bit of a cryptic way in verse 20 and 21. And this is suggestive that he is showing the disciples some sort of expansive meaning about the mission of God's kingdom being more than just about the nation of Israel. Like I said, Doug explored this theme of breaking down barriers in his message last week, and we see that Jesus is continuing to do that here, but I think the other thing that we're seeing this week is that Jesus is exposing the barriers that people bring with them into their interactions with him. We next see this interlude where Jesus speaks to the Pharisees, playing another one of his hits, rebuking the Pharisees who are having the wrong perspective about things. The Pharisees this time are asking for a sign, which is kind of hilarious when you think about what Jesus has just been doing for the last number of chapters, going around feeding people, healing people, casting out evil spirits, even raising people from death. What more could these guys possibly need? He's kind of exposing that they're bringing their own barriers with them. They will not be satisfied with anything that Jesus has to do. But we see that it isn't just the Pharisees who are having trouble seeing who Jesus is clearly. The disciples seem to forget who they're traveling with, as after this sequence we see them worrying about how much food they have, only having one loaf brought along with them. Jesus is warning them about being filled with this yeast of the Pharisees and Herod. And you can recall that yeast is often symbolic of sin in Hebrew culture. What you see kind of referred to as this yeast here, I think, is this doubt or this being willing to play with the ideas that are being presented by these true prophets of God's kingdom, John the Baptist or Jesus now, but then not showing any change in your heart and behavior because of this thing. The disciples are still worrying about what's going to happen to them. No amount of miraculous provision seems to be helping them to figure out how to trust in Jesus. Mark, in his rapid, blunt, kind of almost impatient style, is really the harshest to the disciples in his gospel. Both Matthew and Luke give more credit to the disciples than Mark does. But here we see Jesus is just dismayed with them. And as with many times throughout the gospel, with their unclarity, with their unseeingness. And the theme of this story is really driven home by the little bit of narrative that follows, the last of these hits that Jesus plays before we introduce some new material. Jesus performs another healing, and this time it's a healing of the man's eyes, right? Clearly a symbol of the lack of sight, right? And the lack of spiritual sight that is going on for the disciples. It's significant to notice in this sequence that there's a slower releasing of the healing power. Jesus ends up touching him multiple times, even spits on him as part of the procedure. It's kind of gross. But we see that the man's sight is fully restored eventually. But it is blurry with the first try. We could read something about the man's faith or lack thereof into a story like this. I don't think that that necessarily needs to be the case. I think the commentators are right that Mark is giving us a symbolic anchor point here. Sight, physical, spiritual, it doesn't always come fast or immediately or easily. And we're about to read more stories where we're going to see the disciples' sight be true but blurry. So I want to stop and give you a table talk before we go into before we transition into our next story. Many times in our lives, I think we get stuck like the disciples, fretting about things, or maybe we get like the Pharisees and doubt the things that we know about God. Our attention gets pulled away. Jesus encourages us to seek first God's kingdom and righteousness in Matthew's gospel, and our other needs will be met. That's in Matthew 6:33. In Hebrews, the author encourages us to fix our eyes upon Jesus, who is the founder, beginner, and the finisher, the completer of our faith. Our faith is begun and ends with him. And so that kind of leads us to our table talk question. Here is going to be their first table talk. What things do you find that blur your vision? What do you do to remember to seek God's kingdom first, or to fix your eyes upon Jesus? Okay, so let's carry on with our text. We're going to pick up at verse 27, and we're going to read through chapter 9, verse 13. Then Jesus and his disciples went to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they said, "John the Baptist. Others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And then he warned them not to tell anyone about him. And then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and experts in the law, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke openly about this. So Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But after turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You're not setting your mind on God's interests, but on man's." And then Jesus called the crowd along with his disciples and said to them, "If anyone wants to become my follower, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life because of me and because of the gospel will save it. For what benefit is it for a person to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his life? What can a person give in exchange for his life? For if anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." And he said to them, "I tell you the truth, there are some standing here who will not experience death before they see the kingdom of God come with power." 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them alone up a high mountain privately, and he was transfigured before them. And his clothes became radiantly white, more so than any launderer in the world could bleach them. And then Elijah appeared before them along with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And so Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." For they were afraid, and he did not know what to say. And then a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came from the cloud, "This is my one dear son. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore except Jesus. As they were coming down from the mountain, he gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept this statement to themselves, discussing what this rising from the dead meant. Then they asked him, "Why do the experts in the law say that Elijah must come first?" He said to them, "Elijah does indeed come first and restores all things. And why is it written that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be despised? But I tell you that Elijah has certainly come, and they did to him whatever they wanted, just as it is written about him." So here we arrive at this key story in the gospel. Jesus gets around to asking them this crucial question, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter gets it right. In Matthew's rendering of the story, the writer is even more generous to Peter than here. Jesus says to him, "Blessed are you, this was not revealed by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." Mark isn't quite so kind here. He's moving fast through his story, right? But the point is taken nonetheless. Peter's on to something. The disciples as a group, they're on to something. But Jesus doesn't want them spreading the word that he is, in fact, identifying as the Christ. One of the commentators suggests that the reason for this is because Jesus understands that they, the disciples, still don't fully get what being the Messiah is or is going to entail. And he doesn't want them drumming up some, sort of support for a fight against the Romans or something like that. Consider how John the Baptist has just been treated in our story as well. He was only being political in as much as he was calling out Herod's immoral behavior. And Herod came down on him like a ton of bricks eventually, right? Having him beheaded for the sake of his party guests. What if we have someone here in Jesus who fashions themselves as the heir of David, right? The presumptive king of Israel. This is a dangerous thing to be in this time and place. And so we see Jesus' new message that he starts to give. He starts to work on them to try to identify the job of the Messiah as a job of suffering, right? Being the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. He predicts his own death. And Peter gets this response wrong, right? I sympathize with Peter, again, as he's clearly out of his depth saying, no, Jesus, you're not going to do that, right? I rebuke that. What does he have to say to Jesus? But you kind of get this, like, I don't know, I sympathize with Peter as I read through this story. The rest of the disciples are thinking, right? Peter's a little bit the mouthpiece for the rest of the disciples. So he ends up taking the brunt of the rebuke, and Jesus kind of knows who he's dealing with, and brings Peter back in quickly. And we're going to see that again as we kind of continue through. But Jesus' challenging message goes further than just the disciples, though. And here we see a change in how Jesus addresses the crowds as well. He begins to emphasize the self-sacrificial, self-denying nature of the kingdom of God at the end of chapter 8. And one can almost imagine the crowds beginning to thin as the man who had been, spreading the bread and the fish and, doing the healings and, playing with the kids and being all, friendly and exciting is now saying, take up your cross, and if you're ashamed of the Son of Man, then I'm going to be ashamed of you, kind of a thing. And it's just like, something's changed here, right? There's some expectation. There's some sense of the cost of being faithful in a faithless world, in a world that is still a battleground of good and evil, of powers and principalities. The thinning of the crowds begins here and is going to accelerate as we approach the end of the story, and Jesus ends up becoming a disgraced scapegoat for an enraged mob that's whipped into a frenzy by a misunderstanding religious elite that's concerned more with their position and power than with seeking God's kingdom and righteousness. Jesus doesn't leave the disciples merely with this cryptic teaching about taking up one's cross and some suggestion that that some of those present in that teaching would not experience death until they saw God's kingdom. We next get to see this very strange and exciting story that reinforces what Peter had confessed, this Transfiguration story. There's plenty of Old Testament symbolism going on when you look at the Transfiguration story. They go up a mountain, right? The disciples would have been aware that the presence of God appeared on a mountaintop to these two prophets who show up there as well, right? Moses goes up the mountain to confer with God about the way that the Israelites are going to behave. Elijah goes up onto a mountaintop to be in God's presence, and right, the wind and the fire and the thunder and everything pass by, and then there's a still small voice, and that's where Elijah discovers God's presence. Elijah and Moses had also both left life in this world in odd circumstances on top of a mountain, right? Moses goes up the mountain to die. Elijah gets whisked away in a chariot of fire, as the story goes in the king's records. Now we get to see them both in some way here on the mountain with Jesus. These guys represent the law and the prophets, right? These twin traditions of the Hebrew religious and intellectual life. And in some of the translations, you'll see that Moses and Elijah are not just talking with Jesus, that they're ministering to Jesus. And this demonstrates tangibly Jesus' role as the fulfillment of these two pillars of Jewish religious thinking life. We also get this transposition of the message that we get from Jesus' baptism brought forward into this new context, right? The descriptors of the clothing are reminiscent of the Shekinah glory, right? The pillar of fire that leads Israel through the desert. And we get this, there's all this holiness imagery that's going on there too. Peter, again, awestruck, overwhelmed by what he's seeing, opens his big mouth without having any clear idea of what he ought to be saying in this context. I can't help but kind of admire his boldness as well, although I do shake my head at him some with kind of the hindsight that we get to have, and knowing where the rest of the story is going. Jesus doesn't really rebuke him for his suggestion here. Peter must be thinking like, well, this must be it, right? Jesus, there's Moses, there's Elijah. We can build our encampment. This is the place that we're going to be launching out from to do, God's work. Look at Jesus. He's all ready to glow. He's clothed in power. The heroes of our past have come down to serve him. It's time to build this kingdom. Let's start with a couple of tents. But this is not the right time to be carrying on like this. And Jesus knows this is only going to accelerate the controversy if it turns out there's an encampment up the hill where the glory of the Lord is, or something like that, right? And Jesus already knows what is, the plots that are developing against him, what is brewing, what his end place is, right? I think this misunderstanding aspect is at the center of a lot of this instruction that we're seeing, that Jesus is giving to these various people. So Jesus is encouraging them, don't share what you've seen, right? This is too much for the climate that we're in, this place that we're in. But Jesus doesn't rebuke them any further than that. He just carries on with what is supposed to happen next, which is to head on down the mountain and go on to the next person that he's supposed to minister to. On the way, he explains Elijah's role in the story a little bit more. And we finish off our story today with Jesus connecting Elijah conceptually with John the Baptist. John's example sets a template for Jesus, the Son of Man, as well. And this also, you see the disciples misunderstanding, as they don't quite get that Elijah and John the Baptist are the same guy, the same idea, and that, look what they did to John, what do you think they're going to do to me, right? This kind of like vague, ominous threat. It had to have been difficult for the disciples to accept what Jesus was saying here at this transitional point in the story. They were needing to have their minds reoriented, to give up hopes of a military overthrow of Herod and then of Rome, right? God's kingdom coming was not going to look how these guys thought. And ultimately, Jesus' coronation is not going to be in shining white robes and crowns and the ministering of saints and angels. What he's going to be wearing is a crown of thorns, and he's going to be ministered to very tenderly by the Roman soldiers, right? Jesus' ministry, his time on earth, can't be properly understood without reckoning with his death and resurrection, with this other type of kingdom that we now are invited to participate in. Jesus' kingdom is still very frequently misunderstood. I think we still misunderstand it often in our day, and we struggle with this because we don't have eternal perspective. There's no amount of thinking and wisdom that I can gain to actually abstract myself far enough to think on those terms. But Jesus still encourages us to move our minds towards that thing. I think we have all kinds of responses to our misunderstanding of Jesus' kingdom, to our short-sightedness, that show our short-sightedness. You get people obsessing with like social justice questions inside the church. And it becomes really key to like, we need to build the kingdom of heaven here on earth. Well, that's just building tents, right? We have the millenarian kind of escapism. Well, we just have to like hunker down and wait, and then Jesus is going to whisk us away and let the world go to hell in a handbasket because it's already there. And so we just need to wait and get out of here, right? Also not quite right. You don't see Jesus behaving that way, right? We get sometimes judgmentalness and legalism that creeps in, right? Well, they're doing it wrong, and they're doing it wrong, and they're doing it wrong, and we need to make sure to maintain the purity and the law and the purity, right? And all those kinds of those attitudes, right? Or you get the yearning for God's power. It needs to be displayed here, now, in the ways that I see that it should be displayed, and on my terms, please, Lord, right? Lord? The thing about it is that we do see all of these aspects of Christ's ministry in the Gospels, right? But Jesus doesn't operate merely as a social justice advocate, merely as an escapist millenarian, right? Merely as the judge, merely as a miracle worker, right? He mixes and matches, and he meets the people's needs where they are. And he doesn't just do that. He sometimes meets the needs that they don't know that they have, right? Jesus is bigger, he's doing something bigger, and I'm going to suggest to you that if you're reading through Mark's gospel and you're telling yourself, well, Jesus is exactly who I thought he was, and I'm comfortable with everything that he's done in this story and everything that he does, I think you're not paying close enough attention, right? Jesus is a challenge, and it's part of our responsibility to be responsive to his challenge. Remember, though, that he doesn't just leave us to flail around in our small-mindedness, right? He doesn't just tell us, get thee behind me, Satan, right? He disciples us as he does with Peter, right? He loves us, he cares for us. He's bringing us towards his wisdom if we are willing to follow. It doesn't mean we're going to see everything clearly, but it does mean we'll probably, at least get some of the mud wiped out of our eyes, and we'll start to see things a little bit blurrily. Here's a couple of verses from Romans chapter 12, which describe this kind of growth. Chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what is God's will, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. As you read through the rest of Paul's letter to the Romans, he urges his readers to good works, to hope for the future, to trust in God's justice, and mainly to be diligent in humble service in the here and now, right? Humility here and now, trusting that God is doing something, and we can be on board with that. Jesus is in action. He's on the move. It's just not necessarily going to conform to what we think it should look like. So I'm going to give you a table talk to wrap it up today. How has your understanding of Jesus been challenged lately? Maybe even through reading Mark's Gospel. What do you do to try to keep your eyes fixed on him, his kingdom, and his righteousness? And then take some time to talk with each other, ask each other how to pray for each other today, and then as you go through the week this week, and be blessed.